The first dinner, as the Duchess of Blackwood, was a lesson in geometry. The dining table at Blackwood House in London was a vast, polished expanse of mahogany, a dark, reflective sea that stretched for what felt like a mile between her and her new husband. At one end, she sat, a small, solitary island in a new gown of dove-grey silk. At the far other end, a formidable continent of shadow and silence, sat Alistair, the Duke. They had been married that morning in a quiet ceremony that was more a signing of contracts than a union of hearts. Ilara Linwood, daughter of a respectable but impoverished baron, had understood the terms perfectly. Her father's debts would be settled. Her future, and that of her family, would be secured. In return, she would provide the Duke of Blackwood with what he required, a legitimate heir to carry on the ancient line. His Grace's man of business had been exquisitely clear. It was a transaction, and Ilara, ever practical, had accepted her part in it. She had not, however, expected the sheer, suffocating weight of the silence. The footmen moved like ghosts, their footsteps muffled by the thick Aubusson carpet. Silver clinked against porcelain with the delicacy of a funereal bell. Outside, the sounds of London, the rumble of carriage wheels, the distant cry of a vendor, were a world away, muted by thick velvet curtains and panes of flawless glass. Inside, there was only the vast, empty space between them. Ilara was not a great conversationalist, but she was not a mute. She believed in the civility of shared words, the small bridges built across a dinner table. She cleared her throat, the sound startlingly loud in the stillness. "The city seems very busy, Your Grace," she offered, her voice small but clear. "I imagine the season will be a lively one." The Duke did not look up from his plate. He cut a piece of roasted pheasant with methodical precision. "Indeed." The word was a stone dropped into a well. The ripples vanished instantly. The silence that rushed back in was deeper, heavier than before. She tried again, a flutter of nerves in her chest. She was his wife. This was her home now. Surely some effort was required. She gestured with her fork toward a dark, brooding portrait on the wall, a man with the same sharp jaw and storm-grey eyes as the one seated before her. "That is a magnificent painting," she said. "Is he an ancestor?" Alistair placed his knife and fork together on his plate, the sound a sharp, definitive click. He finally lifted his head, and his eyes met hers across the mahogany chasm. They were chips of ice, devoid of warmth, devoid of interest. They were the eyes of a man surveying a recent and perhaps regrettable purchase. "You will give me an heir, madame," he said, his voice low and utterly devoid of emotion. It was not a cruel tone, not angry. It was something far worse. It was the voice of a man stating a simple, unalterable fact, as one might discuss the weather or the price of corn. Not conversation. That is the sum of our agreement. The world did not stop. The footman did not gasp. The clock on the mantelpiece continued its merciless ticking. But for Ilara, all the air had been pressed from the room. It was not the demand for an heir that shocked her. She had known that. It was the dismissal, the casual, brutal erasure of her mind, her thoughts, her very personhood. She was not a companion, not a partner, not even an acquaintance. She was a vessel, a duty, a function. She did not cry. She had learned a long time ago, under the tutelage of a difficult and demanding governess, that tears were a currency of no value. They bought neither sympathy nor respite. She simply looked at him, this stranger who was now her husband. She saw the hard line of his mouth, the rigid set of his shoulders. She saw a man encased in ice. And she understood. He had not just stated the terms of their agreement. He had drawn a line. On one side was him and his life. On the other was her and her function. Very slowly, she placed her own knife and fork on her plate, mirroring his action. She folded her hands in her lap. She met his cold gaze without flinching, and she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, an acknowledgement, an acceptance of terms. She did not speak again. Not for the rest of the meal. Not when they rose from the table. Not when he bid her a clipped, formal good night at the base of the grand staircase, before turning toward his own wing of the house. She had been given an instruction, and Ilara was nothing if not dutiful. He wanted an heir, not conversation. Very well. He would have his silence. The days that followed in London settled into a strange, silent routine. Ilara was the perfect duchess. She rose at a respectable hour. She met with the housekeeper, Mrs. Croft, communicating her wishes for the day's menus and duties with brief, clearly written notes on heavy cream paper. She took a walk in the park, accompanied by a silent footman. She answered the few formal cards left for her with equally formal written replies. She saw her husband only at dinner. Each evening, they would enact the same grim pantomime. They would sit at opposite ends of the cavernous table. They would eat in absolute silence. He would read documents propped against a silver stand, his attention wholly absorbed. She would eat methodically, her eyes fixed on her plate, or on the play of candlelight on the silver. At first, Alistair felt a grim sense of relief. It was working. The arrangement was precisely as he had intended. Uncomplicated, efficient, devoid of the emotional clutter he so despised. He had a wife. The succession was being addressed. He had done his duty to the title, to the memory of his ancestors, to the gaping hole his younger brother's death had left in the family line. He required nothing more from her, and she, it seemed, required nothing from him. Her silence was a gift, a quiet, orderly space in which he could continue to live his life as he had before, only with the matter of the dukedom's future settled. He did not consider what the silence cost her. He did not consider her at all. Their marital duties were performed with the same cold, silent efficiency. He would come to her rooms late at night, a shadow in the darkness. There were no words, no tenderness, only a grim, focused purpose, an act of dynastic necessity. Ilara would lie still, her body a separate country he was visiting for a brief, specific purpose. She would stare into the darkness and think of England. Or more precisely, she would think of the walled garden at her father's modest estate, the scent of damp earth and climbing roses. She would retreat to that place in her mind, a place he could not touch, could not dismiss. When he was finished, he would leave without a word, and she would be alone again. The silence he left behind was a relief. After a month of this frozen existence in London, a note was delivered to her room. It was from him. The script was black and severe. We removed to Stonefall on Tuesday. Ilara felt the first flicker of something other than numb obedience. Stonefall. The ducal seat in Northumberland. The country. Away from the oppressive, gilded cage of London. Away from the endless, echoing mahogany of the dining table. Perhaps there, in the open air, the silence would feel less like a tomb. She packed her own trunks, dismissing her new lady's maid with a gentle, written note. She folded her plain grey and brown dresses, the modest wardrobe of a baron's daughter that now seemed so out of place, yet so intrinsically her. She had a new title, a new husband, a new life, but under the silk and the responsibility, she was still Ilara Linwood, a woman who preferred gardens to ballrooms and quiet truths to glittering conversation. He had rejected the latter. Perhaps at Stonefall she could find the former. The journey north was conducted in the same profound silence. They travelled in a large, well-sprung carriage, sitting opposite one another. For 2 days, he read. She watched the greening landscape of England slide past the window. She saw rolling hills give way to starker, more dramatic fells. She saw dry stone walls stitching the fields together like careful needlework. She felt the air change, growing sharper, cleaner. As the carriage turned off the main road and onto a long, winding drive, she saw it for the first time. Stonefall. It did not rise from the land so much as it seemed to have been carved from it. It was a vast, sprawling edifice of grey stone, formidable and ancient, with mullioned windows that stared out over the wild landscape like vacant eyes. It was not a welcoming house. It was a fortress, a bastion against the world. It was, she thought, with a flicker of grim irony, the perfect reflection of its master. As the carriage drew to a halt, the great oak doors swung open. A line of servants stood waiting in the cavernous hall. At their head was a tall, severe-looking woman in black bombazine, her silver hair pulled into a tight knot. Her face was etched with a kind of weary loyalty. Alistair stepped out of the carriage and strode into the hall without a backward glance. "Mrs. Gable?" he said, his voice echoing in the stone-flagged space. "All is in order, I trust." "Yes, Your Grace," the housekeeper replied, her gaze flickering for a fraction of a second to the woman who now stepped out of the carriage behind him. Ilara stood on the threshold, a small figure in a plain travelling cloak. She looked at the assembled staff, their faces a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. She looked at the vast, cold hall, the suits of armour standing sentinel in the shadows, the tattered banners of forgotten battles hanging from the rafters. The house felt as though it had been holding its breath for a very long time. Alistair did not introduce her. He did not acknowledge her presence. He was already deep in conversation with his steward, a man who had hurried forward with a portfolio of papers. So Ilara did what she had learned to do. She took matters into her own hands. She walked forward, her back straight, her chin high. She stopped before the housekeeper. Mrs. Gable looked at her, waiting. Ilara did not speak. Instead, she offered the woman a small, genuine smile. And then she held out her hand. It was a simple gesture, an offering of peace, an acknowledgement of shared space. For a moment, the housekeeper just stared at the gloved hand. 1 second. 2. Then, slowly, as if breaking a long-held habit of formality, Mrs. Gable reached out and took it. Her own hand was calloused and strong. The brief touch was a pact, an understanding that passed without words. From across the hall, Alistair happened to look up from his papers. He saw the gesture. He saw the flicker of surprise, and then relief on his old housekeeper's face. He saw his wife, the Duchess, standing there, small and silent, and yet possessing a strange, unshakable dignity. For the first time, a faint, unfamiliar crack appeared in the ice of his carefully constructed world. It was the briefest of moments. Then he turned back to his steward. The papers, the numbers, the cold, hard facts, that made up his life. He dismissed the image. It was nothing. It meant nothing. Spring came to Stonefall not as a gentle awakening, but as a fierce, determined battle against the lingering northern winter. The wind that scoured the fells still had a sharp edge, but the light was changing. The days were lengthening, and in the sheltered corners of the estate, the first stubborn signs of life were emerging. Elara found her rhythm in the quiet, sprawling house. Stonefall was a place of ghosts and memories, most of them belonging to a life that was not hers. But it was also a place of work, a place that needed a hand. The house had been neglected, allowed to slide into a state of managed decline. The Duke, it was clear, had been focused on the larger business of the estate, the mines, the farms, the ledgers, while the heart of the home, the house itself, had grown weary. She began her work in silence. She would walk the corridors, her fingers trailing over dusty furniture and faded tapestries. She made notes. The runner on the west gallery stairs is threadbare, a danger to the staff. The windows in the morning room do not close properly. The damp is getting in. The kitchens require new copper pans. The current ones are worn beyond repair. She would leave these notes on a silver tray in the housekeeper's office. Mrs. Gable would read them, her lips pursed in a thin line of approval, and the work would be done. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the house began to breathe again. The scent of beeswax and lemon oil replaced the musty smell of dust. The windows gleamed. The fires in the hearths burned brighter. Her greatest discovery was the walled garden. It was hidden behind a high stone wall, accessible only through a heavy, iron-studded oak door, for which no one seemed to have the key. After 2 days of inquiries, a young stable boy remembered an old, rusted key hanging on a hook in the back of the potting shed. When Elara finally pushed the door open, her breath caught. It was a ruin, but a beautiful one. A sundial stood askew in the centre, its face green with moss. The stone paths were choked with weeds, but against the south-facing wall, a magnificent climbing rose, ancient and gnarled, had thrown out a riot of defiant, pale pink blossoms. In another corner, a thicket of lavender had gone wild, its scent thick in the air. It was a place that had been loved once, and then forgotten. This became her sanctuary. She did not ask for an army of gardeners. She began the work herself, with a pair of old gloves and a trowel she found in the shed. She spent hours there, pulling weeds, clearing the paths, feeling the sun on her back. The physical labor was a balm. It was real. It was productive. It was a conversation with the earth, and the earth, unlike her husband, answered back. It yielded to her hand, offering up the rich, dark soil, the promise of renewal. Mrs. Gable, seeing her duchess on her knees in the dirt, took it upon herself to assign 2 of the younger garden boys to help. They worked under Elara's quiet direction, communicating in gestures and smiles. They cleared the overgrown beds, pruned the wild roses, and uncovered the bones of a once glorious garden. Alistair observed this from a distance. He would see her from his study window, a small, focused figure in a plain dress and a wide-brimmed straw hat, moving through the resurrected garden. He had not been in that part of the grounds for 2 years, not since Edmund died. It had been his brother's favourite place. His first reaction was a flash of hot anger, an intrusion, a violation of a sacred space. He started to rise from his desk, intent on going down there and putting a stop to it. But he paused. He watched her gently staking a delphinium, her movements careful and precise. He saw the garden boys working, not with the sullen obedience he was used to from his staff, but with a quiet enthusiasm. She was not destroying a memory. She was tending to it. He sat back down, a strange, unsettling feeling coiling in his gut. He told himself it was practical. The Duchess was improving his property. It was a good use of her time. It kept her occupied. It kept her silent. And yet, the image of her in the garden stayed with him. A quiet splash of colour in his monochrome world. His world was one of numbers. He spent his days with his steward, Mr. Henderson, a man as dry and practical as himself. They reviewed accounts, debated crop rotation, and discussed the output of the local lead mines that formed a significant part of the ducal fortune. He was a good landlord, in that he was fair and unsentimental. Rents were collected, roofs were repaired, but there was no warmth, no connection. He was a remote and formidable power. One afternoon, a tenant farmer from an outlying holding requested an audience. The man, whose name was Dobson, was in arrears. His wife was ill, and his youngest son had broken a leg. Alistair listened to the story with his customary impassive expression. The rules were clear. Compassion was a luxury the estate's ledgers could not afford. "The rent is due, Dobson," he said, his voice flat. "You have had ample time." As the farmer was stammering a desperate plea, there was a quiet movement at the door of the study. Elara stood there. She had a small basket on her arm, filled with fresh vegetables from her newly productive kitchen garden. She was on her way to the kitchens, and had not realized the Duke was occupied. She stopped, her eyes taking in the scene. The powerful, implacable Duke behind his enormous desk. The desperate, pleading farmer standing before him, his hat crushed in his hands. She did not speak. She simply looked at her husband, her gaze level and clear. Then she turned her eyes to the farmer, and a flicker of something, pity, understanding, passed across her face. Without a word, she stepped forward, took a large cabbage and a bunch of carrots from her basket, and placed them on the corner of the Duke's desk. Then she turned and walked out, closing the door softly behind her. The action was inexplicable. It was absurd. A cabbage and some carrots, offered as some sort of... what? A tithe? A commentary? Dobson stared at the vegetables. Alistair stared at the vegetables. The silence in the room was absolute. "Your Grace?" Dobson whispered, utterly bewildered. Alistair looked from the vegetables to the farmer's worn, worried face. He thought of his wife's expression. The simple, silent act of charity, of human connection. It was a language he had forgotten how to speak, but he recognized it when he saw it. It made his own cold calculations seem small, mean. He cleared his throat. "The debt will be deferred, Dobson," he said, the words feeling strange in his mouth. "See to your family. Henderson will make the arrangements." The farmer's face crumpled in disbelief, and then overwhelming gratitude. He backed out of the room, bowing and scraping, leaving Alistair alone with the vegetables. He stared at the cabbage as if it were a foreign artifact. His wife had not said a word. And yet, she had changed the outcome of the entire meeting. She had wielded her silence, and a cabbage, with more power than any argument. He did not know what to feel. Annoyance? Yes. His authority had been subtly undermined. But there was something else, too. A grudging respect, and a deep, unsettling curiosity about the woman who moved through his house and his life like a phantom, leaving behind these strange ripples of consequence. That night, at dinner, the silence between them felt different. It was no longer empty. It was filled with the weight of an unspoken question. Who was she? We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. Summer arrived, and with it, the northern landscape exploded into a wild, brief glory. The moors were carpeted in purple heather, and the air was thick with the scent of gorse and the hum of bees. At Stonefall, Ilara's walled garden was a triumph. It was a riot of colour and life, a testament to months of patient, silent work. She had discovered that the previous Duchess, Alistair's mother, had been a passionate botanist, and the garden had been her design. Ilara felt a kinship with this unknown woman, a connection across time. She was not just restoring a garden. She was honouring a legacy. Alistair's unease grew. The silence he had demanded had become a mirror, reflecting his own emptiness. Her quiet, purposeful existence was a constant, unspoken rebuke to his own stagnant grief. He saw her arranging flowers for the house, her touch gentle and artistic. He heard her soft voice giving instructions to the garden boys. He saw her walking on the fells, her figure small against the vast landscape, seemingly at peace in a world that gave him none. He began to try, in his own clumsy, ill-practiced way, to bridge the chasm he had created. "The garden is much improved," he said one evening at dinner. It was the first unsolicited comment he had made to her in months. Ilara looked up, her expression unreadable. She gave a slight inclination of her head. Acknowledged. Not answered. The silence returned, more profound for the brief interruption. He tried again a few days later. He saw her returning from a ride, her cheeks flushed with the wind. "Was your ride pleasant, madam?" he asked, his tone stiff. She paused, dismounting with the help of a groom. She looked at him, and for a moment he thought she might speak. Instead, she simply nodded. "Once." Then she turned and walked toward the house. His frustration mounted. It was perverse. He had set the rule, and she was following it with a maddening, perfect obedience. He was the Duke. He could simply command her to speak. But the words died in his throat. What would he say? "I have changed my mind." "You may speak now." The sheer arrogance of it, the sheer foolishness, was too much even for him. He had made his bed of silence, and now he was forced to lie in it, alone. The library at Stonefall was his last refuge. It was a magnificent room, 2 stories high, lined from floor to ceiling with books. It smelled of old leather and beeswax. It was the one place in the house that felt truly his, a sanctuary of order and intellect. It had also been Edmund's sanctuary. They had spent countless hours in here together, reading, arguing, dreaming. After his brother's death, Alistair had kept it as a shrine, everything exactly as Edmund had left it. One rainy afternoon, driven inside from the garden, Ilara sought refuge in the library. She had not dared to enter it before, sensing it was the Duke's private domain. But the house was oppressive, and she longed for the company of books. She slipped inside, awed by the scale of it. She ran her fingers along the spines, breathing in the scent of paper and time. She chose a slim volume of poetry and settled into a worn leather armchair by the window, tucking her feet beneath her. For the first time in months, she felt a sense of peace. An hour later, Alistair entered the library. He stopped dead on the threshold. He saw her, curled in Edmund's favourite chair, a book open in her lap. The sight was a physical blow. It was a desecration. "What are you doing in here?" he demanded, his voice harsher than he intended. Ilara's head snapped up. She had not heard him enter. She saw the thunderous look on his face, the raw anger in his eyes. She immediately stood, placing the book carefully on the table beside the chair. Her heart was pounding. She had trespassed. He strode into the room, his presence sucking all the air from it. He stopped before her. "This is my library." She looked at him, her face pale, but her expression composed. She knew he was waiting for an apology, an explanation. She knew he was waiting for her to speak. And she would not. She held his furious gaze. Then, with a quiet, deliberate grace, she dipped into a small curtsy, a gesture of deference to his position, his ownership. And then she turned and walked out of the room, leaving him standing there, his anger turning to ash in his mouth. He was left alone with the echo of her silence. He looked at the chair she had vacated, the faint impression of her body still visible in the worn leather. He looked at the book she had been reading. It was a collection of verse by a new poet, one Edmund had admired. Why had he reacted with such fury? Because she was in his brother's chair? Or because she had looked so right there? Because for a fleeting, terrifying moment, she had filled a space that had been empty for too long, and it had felt not like a betrayal, but like a relief. The silence she left behind this time was not peaceful. It was agonizing. It was the sound of his own loneliness. His desperation was a cold, hard knot in his chest. He had to make her speak. He had to undo what he had done. But how? The answer, it seemed, came in the form of a perfumed letter that arrived with the London post. It was from Lady Annalise Finch, the daughter of an earl, and the woman many in society, including Annalise herself, had assumed would one day be the Duchess of Blackwood. She wrote with a gushing, effusive charm, announcing that she and her mother would be in the north visiting relatives and would be simply delighted to impose upon his hospitality for a few days. Alistair read the letter with a sense of dread. Annalise was everything Elara was not: loud, glittering, and relentlessly social. Her conversation was a torrent of fashionable gossip and pointed observations. In his previous life, he had found her tolerable, even amusing. Now, the prospect of her arrival filled him with a profound weariness. But then, a thought struck him. A cruel, desperate, and brilliant thought. Annalise's presence would be a shock to the system. Her constant chatter would throw Elara's silence into sharp relief. Perhaps jealousy, or social pressure, or simple irritation would succeed where his own clumsy efforts had failed. Perhaps another woman's voice would force Elara to find her own. He wrote back a brief, formal note of acceptance. Lady Annalise and her mother would be welcome at Stonefall. They arrived a week later in a cloud of expensive French perfume and a mountain of luggage. Lady Annalise was as radiant and sharp as he remembered, her eyes taking in the state of the house, the servants, and, most particularly, its silent duchess, with a swift, assessing glance. "Your Grace," she cried, sweeping toward Alistair and offering her hand. "How good of you to have us. And this must be the new Duchess." She turned to Elara, her smile a little too bright. "My dear, we are so thrilled to make your acquaintance. The Duke has told us so little about you." Elara, dressed in a simple gown of brown muslin, inclined her head in greeting. The first dinner with their guests was an ordeal. Annalise filled the silence that Alistair and Elara had so carefully cultivated. She chattered endlessly about London, about the latest scandals, about who was marrying whom. Her mother, A woman with the perpetually disappointed air of a minor aristocrat added her own complaints about the state of the roads and the lack of decent society in the north. Alistair found himself watching Elara. She sat with her usual quiet composure, eating her food, listening. She showed no sign of irritation, no flicker of jealousy. She was an island of calm in Annalise's storm of words. "The Duchess is so restful," Annalise commented, her eyes gleaming with malice as she glanced at Elara. "One imagines she must be a great comfort to you, Your Grace, after a long day, so little effort required." Alistair felt a muscle tighten in his jaw. He had once thought the same thing. Now, hearing it from Annalise's lips, it sounded like the insult it was. "My wife," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "has a great deal of sense, Lady Annalise. She does not waste it on trivialities." The shot hit its mark. Annalise's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. She stared at him, surprised by the sharp defense. He was surprised too. The words had come out before he had even thought them. He had defended her, her silence, her dignity. Elara's eyes flickered toward him, just for a moment. There was no triumph in her expression, only a quiet, unreadable watchfulness. The visit wore on. Annalise made a project of Elara, treating her like a pet or a simple-minded child. "My dear Duchess, shall we walk in the garden? Oh, but perhaps the sun is too strong for your delicate constitution." "Do you play the pianoforte, Duchess?" "No?" "What a pity. Music is such a comfort." Through it all, Elara remained serene and silent. She would listen, nod, and then quietly excuse herself to see to her garden or her household duties. Her refusal to be drawn into Annalise's games was a form of power Annalise could not comprehend. She could not fight an enemy who would not engage. One afternoon, Annalise cornered Alistair in the library. "Alistair, we must speak frankly," she said, closing the door behind her. "This is a disaster. The girl doesn't speak. The whole county is beginning to whisper. They call her the Silent Duchess. It reflects poorly on you. You need a wife who can act as your hostess, who can converse, who can manage society. Not this." She gestured vaguely in the direction of the house. Alistair looked at her perfectly coiffed hair, her expensive silk gown, her face animated with ambition and concern that was entirely for herself. He thought of her endless, meaningless chatter. He thought of the noise, the sheer, exhausting noise she brought with her, and he compared it to Elara's silence. A silence that was not empty, but full of dignity, of purpose, of a strength he was only just beginning to understand. A silence that had made him look at his own life, his own grief, his own cruelty, and find them wanting. "I find my wife's company entirely satisfactory, Annalise," he said, his voice cold as the stone of the house. "And I find your concern for my affairs misplaced." He opened the library door for her, his expression leaving no room for argument. Humiliated and furious, Annalise swept out. The next morning, she and her mother made their excuses and departed, leaving a blessed, wonderful quiet in their wake. That evening, at dinner, the silence returned. But it was different now. It was not a weapon. It was not a punishment. It was a space. A quiet space that Alistair now understood was not empty, but waiting for him to be worthy of entering it. The year was turning. Autumn was approaching. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that his time was running out. The first chill of autumn was in the air, a sharp, clean scent of wood smoke and damp earth. The leaves on the great oaks in the park were beginning to turn. their edges tinged with gold and rust. It was a season of endings, and Alistair felt a growing sense of panic. It would soon be a year. A year since he had spoken those fateful, foolish words. A year that she had held him to his brutal bargain. His salvation and his judgment arrived in a handsome black carriage. His mother, the Dowager Duchess Augusta, had come to Stonefall. Augusta was a formidable woman. She was in her late 60s, with eyes as sharp and intelligent as her son's, but tempered with a warmth and a wry humour he had long since lost. She had been a renowned hostess in her day, a woman of great style and even greater substance. Since her husband's death, she had lived a quiet life on one of the dower estates, but she missed nothing. Her letters were infrequent but always pointed. She swept into Stonefall and immediately took charge. She embraced Alistair, her hug surprisingly strong. "You look terrible, Alistair," she announced, holding him at arm's length, like a man who has forgotten how to sleep. Then she turned to Ilara, who stood quietly by the fireplace. The dowager's sharp eyes took in everything: the simple but well-made dress, the quiet composure, the absence of jewels, the unshakable dignity. "And you must be Ilara," she said, her voice softening. She did not wait for a curtsy. She moved forward and took both of Ilara's hands in her own. "My dear girl, I am so very glad to meet you." Ilara looked into the older woman's eyes and saw not pity, but a keen, compassionate intelligence. She felt an unexpected warmth spread through her. She squeezed the dowager's hands in return. A silent answer to the unspoken welcome. Augusta, of course, noticed the silence immediately. She was a connoisseur of social dynamics, and the atmosphere between her son and his wife was a symphony of dysfunction she could read with perfect clarity. For 2 days, she observed. She watched them at dinner, the vast, silent space between them. She watched Ilara managing the household with her quiet notes. She walked with Ilara in the walled garden, listening, or rather not listening, as Ilara communicated her passion for the place through gestures, through the simple act of showing a particularly beautiful rose or a promising new planting. On the 3rd day, she cornered Alistair in his study. "All right," she said, closing the door firmly behind her. "I have been patient. Now you will tell me. What did you do to that girl?" Alistair bristled at her tone. "I have done nothing. She is quiet by nature." Augusta laughed, a short, sharp bark of disbelief. "Quiet by nature? Alistair, that young woman has a mind that is constantly at work. I can see it in her eyes. She is not quiet. She is silenced. And there is only one person in this house with the power to do that. So I will ask you again. What did you do?" He turned away, staring out the window at the bleak, beautiful fells. He could not meet her eyes. The shame was a physical weight. For months, he had lived with his folly. To speak it aloud, to give it voice, felt like a final, damning judgment. But his mother's gaze was relentless. He finally turned back, his face a mask of weary defeat. In a low, clipped monotone, he told her. He recounted the scene at that first dinner. He repeated the words. "You will give me an heir, madam, not conversation. That is the sum of our agreement." The silence that followed was more damning than any tirade. Augusta simply stared at him, her expression a mixture of horror and profound disappointment. "You fool," she whispered, the words trembling with a rare anger. "You absolute, unmitigated fool." She sank into a chair as if her legs could no longer support her. Her father was a scholar. Her mother was a poet. She was raised in a house filled with books and ideas and debate. And you looked at that bright, intelligent girl and saw nothing but a womb. It was after Edmund, he stammered, the excuse sounding weak and pathetic even to his own ears. The duty, the pressure. Grief is not a license for cruelty, Alistair, she snapped, her voice regaining its strength. It is a burden, not a weapon. You asked for a brood mare, and you were surprised when she did not offer you her soul. You are lucky she did not leave you. Her dignity is the only thing holding this sorry excuse for a marriage together. She stood up, her eyes blazing. Do you love her? The question blindsided him. Love? He had not thought of love. He had thought of duty, of annoyance, of frustration, of a strange grudging respect. But love? He thought of her in the garden, with the sun on her hair. He thought of her quiet act of charity with the farmer. He thought of her silent, unshakable defense against Annalise's venom. He thought of the agonizing emptiness of the library after she had left it. I don't know, he said, the admission a raw, painful thing. I only know that her silence is the loudest sound in my life. Then you had better find a way to earn her voice back, his mother said, her tone softening slightly. And it will not be easy. You did not just insult her, Alistair. You denied her very existence. An apology will not be enough. You will have to show her that you see her. The real her, and you had better pray it is not too late. Augusta's words echoed in his head for days. Show her that you see her. But how? He had no language for this. He only knew the language of ledgers and commands. Meanwhile, Ilara found an unexpected ally in the dowager. Augusta would seek her out, drawing her into the quiet rhythms of her day. They would sit together in the morning room, Augusta reading her letters aloud and commenting on them, as if Ilara were responding in kind. They would work on embroidery together, the silent companionship more comfortable than any conversation Ilara had ever known. Augusta did not press her to speak. She simply included her, creating a space for her that was not defined by her silence. One evening, unable to sleep, Ilara found herself wandering the quiet corridors of the house. A light was on under the door of the Duke's study. She knew he was in there, wrestling with the estate accounts, a task he often performed late into the night. She felt a strange pull, a need to. What? She wasn't sure. She found herself walking past the study and toward the library. The room was dark, but a sliver of moonlight fell through the high windows, illuminating the rows of books. On a sudden impulse, she went inside. She did not turn on a lamp. She simply stood in the quiet darkness, feeling the presence of all those sleeping stories. She ran her hand along a low shelf, her fingers trailing over the leather spines. Her hand stopped on a large, plain ledger, out of place among the more ornate volumes. Curious, she pulled it down. It was heavy. She carried it over to the window, angling it to catch the moonlight. It was not a ledger. It was a scrapbook, a collection of sketches and pressed flowers. She opened it carefully. The first page was a drawing, a remarkably skilled pencil sketch of the walled garden, as it must have been years ago, in its full glory. Underneath, in a youthful, exuberant hand, was written, Edmund's Paradise, June, 1817. Edmund, Alistair's younger brother. She turned the pages, her heart beating a little faster. It was a chronicle of a young man's love for his home. There were sketches of the fells, of a favourite horse, of the view from the highest point on the estate. There were pressed flowers from the garden, each one carefully labelled in Latin. There were notes, observations, fragments of poetry. It was a book brimming with life, with joy, with a deep and abiding connection to Stonefall. Tucked into the back of the book was a small bundle of letters tied with a black ribbon. Her hands trembled as she untied it. They were letters from Alistair to Edmund, sent from university. She knew she shouldn't read them. It was a violation of a privacy far more profound than entering a library. But she couldn't stop herself. She had to understand the man who had wounded her so deeply. She read the first letter. Alistair's handwriting was the same severe script, but the tone was entirely different. It was warm, teasing, full of brotherly affection. He advised Edmund on his studies, mocked a particularly pompous professor, and asked, with genuine concern, about the progress of the garden. "Tell me the truth, little brother," one passage read. "Has Mother's new rose survived the frost? I hold you personally responsible for its welfare. Do not let me return to find you have neglected your duties as head gardener." Another letter spoke of the future. "When I am old and grey, and buried in ducal paperwork, you will be the one to keep Stonefall's heart beating. You have the soul for it. I only have the head." She read for an hour, the moonlight her only lamp. She saw a different Alistair. A young man who was not cold and remote, but protective, loving, and deeply aware of the burden of the title that awaited him. A man who had seen his brother not as a spare, but as the soul of their family, the keeper of its joy. And she finally understood. The man who had spoken those cruel words at the dinner table was not the real Alistair. He was a shell, a man hollowed out by grief, crushed by a duty he believed he had to bear alone. His cruelty to her had not been about her at all. It had been about him, about the brother he had lost, and the joy that had died with him. She carefully retied the ribbon around the letters and placed them back in the scrapbook. She slid the heavy book back into its place on the shelf. The anger she had held on to for so long, a hard, protective stone in her chest, had dissolved. In its place was a vast, aching pity, and something more, a flicker of hope. He was not a monster. He was a man in mourning, a man who had forgotten how to live. She left the library, her steps quiet but sure. The year of silence was almost over, but the path forward was no longer about retribution or pride. It was about something else entirely. It was about seeing if the man in those letters could be brought back to life. The anniversary arrived. A full year, 365 days since she had last spoken a word to her husband. The day was grey and overcast, the sky a low, oppressive ceiling of bruised cloud. A fine, persistent drizzle slicked the stones of the terrace and blurred the edges of the distant fells. Elara dressed for dinner, with particular care. She chose the dove-grey silk, the same gown she had worn on that first night. It felt right. A circle closing. She looked at her reflection in the mirror. She was different now. The uncertainty was gone, replaced by a quiet strength. Her face was thinner, perhaps, but her eyes were clear. She was no longer just a baron's daughter or a silent duchess. She was the mistress of Stonefall. She knew its secrets, its sorrows, its rhythms. She had become a part of the place, and it a part of her. When she descended the grand staircase, Alistair was waiting for her in the hall. This was unusual. He was usually already in the dining room, engrossed in his papers. He stood by the fire, not reading, just watching the flames, He looked up as she approached. His face was pale, his eyes shadowed with a profound weariness. He looked, she thought, like a man on the eve of his own execution. He did not speak. He simply offered her his arm. This, too, was new. Stunned, she placed her hand on his sleeve. The fabric of his coat was fine wool, and she could feel the tension in the muscle beneath. It was the most intimate contact they had shared, outside of the cold necessity of their marital bed. He led her toward the dining room. As they reached the door, she braced herself for the sight of the long, polished table, the yawning chasm that had defined their marriage. But when the footman opened the doors, she stopped. The room was changed. The great, long table was gone. In its place was a small, round table, set for only two. It was placed before the roaring fire, and the candelabra in its center cast a warm, intimate glow. The two chairs were close enough to touch. It was a gesture so profound, so unexpected, that it took her breath away. Months ago, in one of her early notes to Mrs. Gable, she had suggested this very thing, writing that it seemed a great waste of heat and effort to serve two people in such a vast space. The suggestion had been quietly ignored. But he had remembered. He led her to her chair and seated her. Another small, unaccustomed courtesy. He sat opposite her, the space between them now measured in inches, not yards. The footman served the first course, and then, with a glance from the Duke, withdrew, closing the doors behind them. They were alone. The silence in the small circle of light was different. It was not a void. It was a presence, humming with unspoken words, with the weight of a year of sorrow and misunderstanding. Alistair did not touch his food. He simply looked at her, his hands clasped on the table before him. The firelight flickered in his grey eyes, and for the first time she saw not ice, but a deep, turbulent sea of regret. "Elara," he began, his voice rough, as if he had not used it for this purpose in a very long time. He stopped. He cleared his throat and started again. "I was wrong." The words were simple, unadorned, but they held the weight of a year's reflection. That night, in London. What I said to you, it was the cruelest, most unforgivable thing a man could say. There is no excuse for it. My grief, my foolish pride. They are reasons, not excuses. I took my own pain, and I made it a weapon, and I used it on you, who deserved it least of all. He looked down at his hands. I built a prison of silence, and I thought I was locking you in it. It took me months to realize I had locked myself in with you, and that you were free, and I was the prisoner. I watched you. I watched you bring this house back to life. I watched you in the garden. I watched you show a kindness to my tenants that I had forgotten how to show myself. You did it all without a word. You showed me what a true heart, a true spirit was. And you did it while living with the ghost of my cruelty every single day. He looked up, and his eyes were shining with an unshed moisture. I have spent a year in a prison of my own making, Elara. I am asking. No, I have no right to ask. I am begging you. Please forgive me, and speak to me. She looked at him, this powerful, broken man. She saw the Alistair from the letters, the protective older brother, buried under the weight of a title he never truly wanted. She saw the man who had defended her to Annalise, the man who had remembered her note about the table, the man who had, in his own desperate way, been trying to find his way back to her, back to himself. She thought of the year of silence. It had begun as a shield, a way to protect the small, essential part of herself that he had tried to deny. It had become a habit. And then it had become a choice. Now she had another choice to make. She looked at the shortened table, the two of them finally within reach. She thought of the sketches of the garden. She thought of the man in the letters, the boy who had charged his brother with protecting a single rose. She reached out her hand and placed it over his on the table. His skin was cold, but his grip, when it closed over hers, was desperate and warm. She drew a breath. The first word felt strange, a foreign object in her mouth. Alistair. It was just his name, but it was everything. It was forgiveness. It was a beginning. The tension in him broke. A long, shuddering breath escaped his lips, and he lowered his head, pressing her hand to his forehead. He did not weep, but she felt a single, hot tear fall onto her skin. She let the silence sit for a moment longer, a final, respectful farewell to the year that had passed. Then she spoke again, her voice a little rusty, but clear and strong. "You have been mourning," she said softly. "You have been carrying a weight that was too heavy to bear alone." He raised his head, his eyes searching hers, full of disbelief and a dawning hope. "How did you know?" "I found the letters," she confessed. "The ones you wrote to Edmund. I went to the library one night. I'm sorry, I should not have read them." "No," he said, shaking his head. "No, I'm glad. I'm glad you saw. I wanted to tell you. I didn't know how. He was the heart of this place, the heart of me. When he died, I thought the only way forward was to close everything off, to just do the duty. I thought that was strength. I didn't realize it was a different kind of death." "It is not a weakness to feel, Alistair," she said. "It is not a weakness to need help carrying the weight." And so they talked, for hours. The food grew cold on the plates, forgotten. She told him about the garden, about her conversations with the earth. She told him about her quiet discoveries in the house, the small histories she had uncovered. He told her about Edmund, about their childhood, about the crushing weight of the dukedom after his brother's accident. He spoke of his fear, his loneliness, his profound, suffocating grief. It was not a confession and an absolution. It was a sharing, a slow, careful unwrapping of two wounded hearts. For the first time, they were not a duke and his duchess, not a man and his function. They were Alistair and Elara, two people at a small table in a circle of warm light, finding their way back to each other, word by painful, precious word. When the fire had burned down to embers, and the sky outside was beginning to lighten with the first hint of dawn, he stood and gently pulled her to her feet. He did not lead her to her wing of the house. He led her to his. And for the first time, when he closed the door to his bedchamber, it was not to perform a duty, but to welcome his wife home. Epilogue. 1 year later, the walled garden at Stonefall was a masterpiece. It was late summer, and the air was heavy with the scent of 1,000 blooming things. Roses climbed the ancient stone walls in a riot of crimson and cream. Lavender hedges buzzed with bees. The delphiniums stood like tall blue sentinels guarding beds overflowing with phlox, daisies, and heavy-headed peonies. In the center of the garden, by the newly righted sundial, Elara sat on a stone bench, a book lying open but unread in her lap. She was watching her husband. Alistair was on one knee, his back to her, carefully staking a climbing clematis. He was wearing old trousers and a linen shirt with the sleeves rolled up, his ducal dignity entirely forgotten. He was talking, a low, happy murmur directed at the plant. He was explaining, with great seriousness, why its current trajectory was unacceptable, and how this new arrangement would afford it a much better view of the fells. A small boy of about 5, the son of the head gardener, stood beside him, watching with solemn concentration. "Will that make it happy, Your Grace?" the boy asked. Alistair turned his head, and a smile transformed his face, crinkling the corners of his eyes. It was a genuine, easy smile, a sight Elara now knew as well as her own heartbeat. "It is our solemn duty to try, Thomas," he said. "The Duchess insists upon it. A happy garden is a happy home." He finished his work and stood up, brushing the dirt from his hands. He saw Elara watching him, and his smile deepened. He walked over to the bench and sat beside her, draping an arm around her shoulders. She leaned her head against him, a comfortable, familiar gesture. Her own body was round and heavy with the child she would bear in the autumn, his heir. But the word no longer held the cold, clinical weight it once had. It was a word of joy, of continuation, of their shared future. "Are you lecturing the plants again?" she asked, her voice laced with amusement. "They require firm guidance," he said defensively. "Especially the clematis. It has rebellious tendencies. Much like my wife." She laughed, a sound that was now as much a part of Stonefall as the wind in the trees. "I seem to recall my rebellious tendency was to do exactly as you commanded." His expression sobered. The memory of that year still a tender spot between them. "A year of silence," he said softly. "It feels like another lifetime, like it happened to 2 different people." "Perhaps it did," she said, placing a hand over his. "That man is gone, and that woman, she has found her voice." He turned her face to his and kissed her, a long, slow kiss that tasted of sunshine and summer, and a love that had been hard-won, a love that was not a transaction, but a choice, a daily, conscious, and joyful choice. The house behind them was alive. The windows were thrown open to the warm air. The sounds of a busy, happy household drifted out into the garden. Stonefall was no longer a fortress or a tomb. It was a home. Alistair, once the cold duke, had become the man from the letters. The man with a head for business, but a heart that had been reopened. And Elara, the silent duchess, was its soul. He had demanded an heir, and she would give him one. But in her year of quiet dignity, she had given him something far more valuable. She had given him back his life. She had shown him how to speak the language of the heart again. And he, in turn, had learned to listen. It was a conversation that, they both knew, would now last a lifetime. "Thank you for listening to the story, all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from, and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories."